So we'll start the webinar in just like 10 minutes. We have Professor H.M. Desada with us, who will be the third panelist for this session. Professor Purohit will be joining us shortly.
Yeah, sure.
I welcome all of you on behalf of Social Nexus Foundation and Students of Peace. We'll start the official session in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone.
Hi.
Hello. Is that a dog?
Hi.
Do I hear a dog barking?
Yes, yes, it is there. Somewhere.
Man's best friend. One of my books.
Oh, yes. Yes, I have it. I have a copy.
Ah, I'm honored.
Yes.
Hi,
Hello.
Pradyumn, hi.
Hi. Hello, Bajpai.
Hello, sir.
Hello, Bajpai ji, मैं देसरडा.
Ah, hello, sir. How nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Yes. ये मेनोचा है ये?
Ah, hello, Dr. Purohit.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi. Hi,
Hi.
Pratham.
हाँ.
Shall
We all
start?
have beards. Isn't that funny? 3 beards. Yes. 4 beards. 4
Oh,
beards.
Not all the same.
This is hilarious.
Not all.
So very senior professor of mathematics had a theory that all the people who have beard are still searching. all those who have found are clean shaven.
Yes, they have nowhere to search.
Nowhere to search.
Okay, fine. Good note.
I guess we can begin. I think someone is going to introduce from Social Nexus Foundation.
Yeah, Pradyum sir, we can begin. I would request Sora to please give the introduction for the event, and then we can proceed towards it.
Excuse me, Manan, I would be giving the introduction on behalf of Social Nexus Foundation. I hope
Okay,
that.
Raj, please go ahead.
Okay, sure. So hello everyone, very good afternoon. I am Raj Shekhar and I am present today on behalf of the Social Nexus Foundation and hold special joy in welcoming you all to today's panel discussion on Gandhian perspective on the decentralization of power in the light of Panchayati Raj, which we are holding in collaboration with Student for Peace. For today's discussion, we have distinguished panelists, Professor Mark Lindley sir, Professor H.M. Desada sir, Dr. Alok Bajpai, and we have Professor Pradyumna Anil Purohit sir, who will be the moderator and will be leading the rest of the session. We hope to have a very fruitful and enlightening discussion today.
Thank you, Rajshekar, for a brief introduction and setting the formalistic tone and the proper beginning of the session. Um, so, so thank you very much, both the Students for Peace, Mahatma Gandhi Center for Peace Studies, and Social Nexus Foundation for coming up and bringing all the people together and such a fascinating bearded panel amongst us. And let's uh, let's begin, as to say. So the title of our panel today is Gandhian Perspective on Decentralization of Power in Light of Panchayati Raj. And as I understand in Gandhi's word that he's always about inculcating a particular system, he always envisioned an analytical model or a corporate structure for the village republics. So we start from that sort of premise whenever we think about Panchayati Raj institution and Gandhi together and in the same basket. Now I'll briefly introduce, we have three eminent speakers today, of course, goes without saying, the bearded ones. First of all, we have Dr. Alok Bajpai, a renowned psychiatrist and a Gandhian scholar, Professor Mark Linley, a person who wears many hats. I've known him for someone who can talk about from Bach to Bapu. And he is an economist and a musicologist by training. And of course, we have very own Professor H.M. Desarda, an economist. He's a voice of environment in Maharashtra and India and world over. And he generally speaks about and is quite vocal about issues related to natural resources around us. Thus, the format that we are going to sort of follow is that it's going to be very simple. Each of our panelists would speak for 20 minutes, and before a panelist goes in, I'll try to chip in few more words in the introduction of their or introducing their introductions once more. And I will try not to be a fussy headmaster and or maybe I'll try to be a fussy one to make sure that everyone sort of concludes within 20 minutes. And that's the allotted time, so that we had sufficient time for various people who are attending this session for the question answer, and then we can also have cross-cutting points with each other. So the audience, please keep your pen and paper or keys ready, and we'll take your questions at the end on the basis of fastest finger first. So that's going to be a format. So let's start with our first speaker, that is Dr. Alok Bajpai. So let me introduce all of you in some more words. Dr. Bajpai's talks generally on his own speciality, but at the same time, Gandhi appears to be some sort of a leading example and, as the word goes, leitmotif. He is also a curator of the program An Hour with Mahatma that is centered around the transformative skills on Gandhi. And for him, Gandhi has always been a tool to improve life skills, and his exploration continues in applying Gandhi's tools for various walks of life, especially conflict resolution and compassion. I hope my introduction was okay and would do good for Dr. Alok Bajpai. Now I wouldn't take much of your time, and I would pass on the virtual microphone or unmuted microphone to Professor Alok Bajpai to continue with his talk, and I'll mute myself.
Thanks, Pradyumna. It was a very generous introduction. And when you talk of Gandhi and you are talking about me, that I'm slightly bashful about it. So nevertheless, so I'll just come to the topic straight without making too much of ado about it. When we talk of this decentralization and Panchayati Raj, or the concept which Gandhi had, we have to go back to the basics. And whatever I have understood of Gandhi, we often do a mistake of, and a lot of people do it. When we talk about Gandhi and we split Mahatma Gandhi into his political, to spiritual, to economic activity, to personal activity, to sexual activity, we will miss out this man. Because for him, as I look at it as a psychiatrist, and I also work in neurosciences, and I'm trying to map Gandhi's transformative process to what we know of neuroscience today, it appears that for Gandhi, very early in life, the whole life was a thread of unity. And from one activity to the other, he moved on smoothly as he mastered one uh, area of endeavor. He moved on to the other, encouraged by the success. And we all know these things, whether it was disposition or his principles in ashram, or even as a barrister, he was trying to reconcile. He was known as a reconciliatory barrister in South Africa because he wouldn't pitch people to fight. Now, all the budding lawyers should know that, because he was earning a huge amount of money. He left that. So he actually was traversing all aspects of life and trying to create an alternative. Anything which creates a gap between human beings. Possession, ego, sexuality, the division of caste, of gender. He was actually trying to remove all these gaps, because for him, probably he had realized there is something called empathy in human head.
Sleeper.
And somewhere along the line, his mind had believed that everybody is united somewhere. And India is mine, I am an Indian, not in the sense of later politician, but being entwined with them. This, I think, was the basis of his non-violence also. The basis of non-violence was, if I do a mistake, somebody else can also do it. And if somebody else has done it, I can also do it. That means somewhere along the line, we all are same. And if we all are the same, whom to do violence against? So I'm not going to do violence against myself. Now, this thought was something which he kept transforming. One. Second level, we all know that freedom struggle came in between Gandhi, but he was out to do some civilizational change. Right? We all know that somebody asked him, what is the idea of Western civilization? He said, it's a good idea. Right? So he was not going back to tradition in the way people are going back today. He was actually trying to bring out all the qualities which Indians had in the larger civilization of 5,000 years or whatever. So where equality was one of the important things. But if you really ask, and it took me also a lot of time, and obviously anybody who looks at Gandhi, that if you ask people, I do this in my program an hour with them, I said to speak some words which relate to Gandhi. People will say Hinsa, non-violence, truth, this, that, depending on what level they are thinking about Gandhi. But very few people bring out a word called autonomy. Right? Gandhi was actually standing for the freedom of mind. Although the way he was telling it appeared as a very, very disciplinary, very, very rigid authoritarian way in his mind, but it was not so. The end product of all this was to free yourself from all the clutches which pull you down as a human being, which creates gaps in your head, so that you can have an autonomous will to think about how to exist as a human being and how to relate to other human beings. Now, free will is still a debate which is going on in neuroscience and philosophy. Although neuroscience is going against free will these days, everything appears to be more deterministic, but then the debate still continues. Gandhi is an outlier. Gandhi is an outlier of all those who say that the life is deterministic and everything is pre-decided and you have no free will. People like Gandhi actually show that there is. Because I think from a very early age, nothing in Gandhi's life was unconscious. Right from his dress to speaking to food, he was not using it for his personal benefit. The whole idea was to unite people. If we think about this, and we know what he thought about state, all of us know it. Now, if we extend this whole idea into his idea of Panchayati Raj, then we can understand it better. Obviously, we have to see that the Panchayati Raj which Gandhi was talking in his age was different from the Panchayati Raj of today. Because the whole intention and idea was different. His idea was not to make a Panchayati Raj which can play as the smallest building block of the centralized power. the way it happens. It comes down from a centralized power to Panchayati Raj being the last stone in the whole thing. His whole idea was, and he writes it, that what I want to do is make one small circle and then oceanic waves which are going out, and so that no wave suppresses the other. And at one point of time, being very fond of geometry and all, we all know he loved that. He goes on to say that people may taunt me as that this is a utopia. But if people cannot prove a Euclid's point, or if they can prove it, same thing can happen with Panchayati Raj also. So I visualize it differently. His idea was perfect actually. And I'm an urban bred man, but I'm incomplete. Because I miss out that idea which Gandhi had. Unfortunately, from 30th January 1948, 17 past 5, India took a different route. While the world was waiting for us to show an alternative model of living, we went on to something which the world had already experienced. Now, I visualize it as each panchayat, which would be the executive of a village, not the power of the village. The power would still be with people. Each one should be educated. Each one should be skilled to earn their bread and butter. Each one should share with people. So, which would cut down the greed and all that. And such units, in simplest term, whatever number of villages are, that number of units would exist, trading with each other and having due respect. Now, this is a honeycomb structure. And honeycomb structures we know are the strongest one. So if each cell is existing in its own, connected to the other, still maintaining independence, within which the subunits, the people will also have their independence. So that shared decentralized power, he was not interested in power. Actually, what power word comes in, Gandhi also uses a word called corporate at one point of time. And we know there were no corporates at that time. Now, if you say Gandhi was using corporate, people will start jumping. We are also talking about corporates. But Gandhi's corporate was, I think it was not corporation, it was cooperation. His idea was very simple, that all of us are valid human beings. All of us have strength. All of us have weaknesses. All of us have skill sets. So let us enhance that. Give validity to each other as human beings. For executive purposes, you can have 5 people, the power of the ayat of punch, which will be operationally deciding things to happen, not as a power source, but actual demo. So he brought democracy to the individual. As a psychiatrist, I think the problem in our country, let's talk of India right now. It's because we are sitting here. Although there is no democracy in our homes. I mean, between a husband and wife, between a father and a son, between neighbors. So we don't really practice democracy where we give value to the thought of the other. That cannot come unless you have real empathy. So his whole idea of the unity was to bring it back, democracy, to the individual mind, who can step out of their selfish existence, share it with people, grow it up to few individuals, to family, to panchayat, and so on and so forth. And so his insistence on village was perfectly planned thing. You have few nodes, cities, rest of the villages, to which everybody can relate and cooperate and have a, obviously non-violence would emanate from it. It will be a prerequisite also, but such type of practice would have non-violence emanating. So his vision was a very, very broad vision. Obviously, it went beyond day-to-day survival, because he was saying you survive, but you also look beyond all that. Unfortunately, what happened to whoever was in a hurry in this country, suddenly in 57, they realized, oh, we have forgotten Gandhi. And sir, if you, there's this serial made by Shyam Benegal, on Samvidhan, making of constitution. If you watch it carefully, till Gandhi was alive, 48, there was still a shadow of Gandhi looming over constitution makers. The moment he died, it went on to a different trail altogether. And villages were the one who were criticized by people in their concluding speeches. I would not name them for practical reasons, but they were the people who were criticizing. So they totally forgot. From 48 to 57, they had no idea what they were doing. Suddenly somebody's conscience came of the, what are we doing with Gandhi? We have stuck him onto the notes and police stations. So they said, oh, BJP committee banao, we will go back. They brought in some other Panchayat Raj. Panchayat Raj today is not the Panchayat of Gandhi. Today's Panchayat is still as centralized as the government in Delhi. It is just an extension of that. Because they do not have a power, or people do not have a power to really modify the conditions in which they are living. Everything is so determined from some centers that you have no choice. What Gandhi was saying was entirely opposite. You define your life here. You have your resources. You use them. You develop your skill. In Hindi, I say that Gandhi was saying, give a BA degree to everybody, but do not snatch away their father's profession. So they can be a PhD making a shoe. What is the problem in that? America does it. We don't do it. So what is the bottom line? The bottom line is the dignity of labor. We cannot claim dignity of labor still. Even if we are talking about Kaushal Vikas or we are talking about vocational training, Indian parents will peel off their skin to get a BTech degree. Because BTech is superior to a cobbler. A surgeon is a superior to what is a surgeon? More skilled than a cobbler. It's so difficult to put a needle into a leather. None of us would have tried it actually. Try sewing a shoe. So he was saying you can be philosopher and you can be cobbler still. What is the problem? He didn't mention it in these words, but that's what he was saying. We snatched away the father's profession. We gave away BAs. Every BA shifted to the city with all the dreamy eye. None of the dreams were fulfilled. Then they do all the violence in frustrations. So obviously the link has broken now. So it will be very, very imprudent to even talk of today's Panchayat in Gandhian context. However, if Gandhian idea can be brought back, then these ideas of vocational training, if we start working today, I think next 20 years, when parents will learn at the bottom line that it is okay to do other things. You have to go back to schools. The drift to villages is happening, but in the form of farmhouses. And the Panchayat is selling those fields to farmhouses. Ask every rich man, they'll have it. They'll go to the Sarpanch will say, ye zameen le lijiye, ye le lijiye, isme. So everybody will make some hut-like thing and think I am a villager. Everybody wants to do farming, but from within the AC. I mean, Gandhi would have been appalled if he sees this country right now. He will say, Bhaiya, I take back my Panchayati Raj. I don't want this. You cannot do it. I mean, it may sound very, very hopeless, but it is not hopeless. The problem is nobody wants to go back to villages. So whom the Panchayat Raj is ruling is the people who listen to them. So Panchayat listens to the district listens to the center and so on and so forth. So I think there are two different ideas of today's Panchayati Raj. I think for Gandhi's posterity, they have given a name to this. But I think in the young generation, we can teach them some other ways of living respectfully. So forget those villages. At least even if within city, we have some dignity of labor, where people have some respect for themselves when they are doing. That was the real idea of Panchayati Raj, what Gandhi meant. Of life with dignity, life with autonomy to think, life to give respect to the other, and sharing. That was his idea. So I would just end it here with whatever I understand of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bajpai. Thanks very much for putting things into perspective in a way and bringing out the essential terminologies in which Gandhi spoke about village republics and the scheme of things then and now. And we wish that the present industrial post-Westphalian or whatever way we want to define our present domestic and foreign affairs in the sense are, in the words of Gandhi, might be a good idea in a very feeble way, the Gandhi used to say. So let's move on to our next speaker. Professor Mark Linley requested that you would like to go at last, so I would ask Professor H.M. Desarda to give his talk, and I would, introduce him a bit with few more words. He's a renowned economist. He is constantly writing about land, water, ecology, environment, and employment. Sometimes you can see him on television, on popular news media, trying to raise his voice amongst the circus that we have, but his voice is heard. Alongside being an economist, he is also a social activist. He is an advocate of Gandhian perspectives and philosophy. And he also brings immense experience of working, making, and challenging various laws and policy within the system, outside the system, and trying to, bring a change. It doesn't matter how it comes, whether being sometimes part of the planning machinery and sometimes outside the planning machinery. So without further ado, I'll request Professor H.M. Desarda to begin his talk. And his time starts now.
Namaskar. I think what introduction you have given, I would tell the people and they would have expectation. Of course, I would share some of those things. After what Alokji, the broad contours of Gandhi, the man, he has put from a psychological and human perspective, which is the right way to begin. I would say that Gandhi intuitively and intellectually both looked at the world in a very unique way. His basic premise to look at the man and society and civilization is a relationship, an organic relationship between human being, society.
Here's what I found.
Human being, society, and nature. And this is very important because today that relationship, particularly more than 100 years after Gandhi wrote some of his seminal ideas in Hind Swaraj, in which he has made a very strong critique of civilization. And it is very noteworthy that Gandhi did not despise or critique in a negative way everything Western. In fact, he said, modern Western industrialism, the three words. And Gandhi was using all his words very simple and meaningful, but in a very powerful way. Modern Western industrialism is the enemy of anything that makes the sense from the point of view of well-being of people, well-being of all living beings, and of course, the nature, Vasundhara, the Mother Earth. And Gandhi was very uncomfortable ever since he went to England about the way the growth was being perceived. he was very much opposed to the model of growth and governance, both. And that's why he was against the British Raj in India. Not that he wanted British to go and colored people to take over. He always said that. So in a way, he was trying to demystify the development, the very concept of development. And incidentally, my name is Desarda, and I would say 3 Ds you could remember is demystify. And Gandhi used all forums in his life to demystify or rather unravel the meaning of life and living. Secondly, he wanted everything to be more organic, democratic. In fact, his idea of village was the what? Not a small habitation. It was face-to-face community. Gandhi defined, and he would call a people living in a cities in the mohalla also a community. I mean, a face-to-face community. So once you demystify, then you come to democratize and then decentralize. And as Panchayati has said, the idea of the Panchayat and decentralization that Gandhi perceived was very different. In fact, when in an early phase of the constitution making, some of the documents were taken to him, or some of the debates. He said, where is the institution which is the most basic institution of governance, and which is the basic institution of the way the people should live and think and produce and all that, is the community. And that's why Article 40 in the Constitution came as a sort of a concession, so to say, to Gandhi. And all through his, whether in England, being a member of a vegetarian society, or in South Africa during his ashrams, you would note that Gandhi was a communitarian. Community was the center stage for him. And when the idea of a panchayat, and he found that why the models of growth and governance, whether it was the traditional, that doesn't mean he idealized everything. The idea of the feudal community was certainly not something that you subscribe to. And the relationship between man and nature, or humans and society, should be such that Sabai Bhumi hai Gopal ki, all resources should belong to everyone. The basic entitlement of resources. And that's why he was very insistent on a braid labor. Everyone doing a productive work, because that will bring him close to nature. And the organic relationship with the nature would cut the man from the unnecessary, waste of resources. Kudrat, Prakriti, the nature, thus is a foundation on which to build the human society. And his critique was always civilizational, whether it is in Hind Swaraj and other writings. In particular, Gandhi was always, whether it was when he established a university which is a different as a Gujarat Vidyapith, as a practicing school where people will learn all crafts of life along with the other values and vision that you need to make a good society. The 2 speeches, the landmark speeches he made in his life to the educationist or to the academician. One was at the inauguration of the Banaras Hindu University in 1916. and Gandhi spoke at the last, and the least he was allowed because Ani Besant was very uncomfortable with Gandhi speaking in the language of the people. He spoke in Hindustani, whereas all others, हम लोग अभी सब अंग्रेजी में बात कर रहे हैं, पता नहीं सबको हिंदी है या नहीं, लेकिन हम बात उसी में कर रहे हैं. And another speech, very remarkable one, to the Indian Economic Association, again at the Muir's College in Allahabad, which was the premier college at the Allahabad University. Gandhi, he said, what I said about the demystification, Gandhi comes out best there. He says, you see, I have not read any textbook of economics, Adam Smith or any Malthus or Malthus, but I know I have read the scriptures, and probably the scriptures, they teach you the path of dharma, and all the economics that you need is doing your duty, and there the paid labor and communitarian approach to the management of resources. And this is what I think was very crucial. But these ideas remain, and you know, he reminded even as late as 1945 to Jawaharlal Nehru on the eve of independence, when the transfer of power and other discussion was going on, that I would like, as people call you my hair, Jawaharlal, and I think that you are going to run the reins of this country. I don't know how long I will live, but I want you to understand my basic philosophy of life. For him, you know, the economics, ethics, and ecology, they were not separate. They were his, and people always say, Gandhi ki niti theek hai, lekin arth niti theek nahi hai. Gandhi ki niti or arth niti, economics and ecology and environment, policy, they all are organic. You cannot, and the seven sins to which he refers, in which the politics without the principles, in which the niti he defines in a very very definite way. So I think when keeping in view all this context, when we come to Panchayati Raj and the decentralization model, incidentally, when the 73rd and 74th Amendment to the Constitution were passed, I mean almost 25 years after the independence or much later, and there were, as you have said, Purohitji, I was a part of the process that was debating some of these legislations, decentralization, powers to panchayat and powers to the urban local bodies. There were in fact the three tiers of the government. We always think the government is the central government, union government, and the states. Yes, that's a federation. But there is a third layer and third tier of the government, that is the government, the governance at the level of the local community. And his idea of panchayat was very different. It was rooted in a Gram Sabha, which was a natural assembly of all the leaders in the village. And in fact, when Gandhi, after independence, was when he sensed, and when in fact in the thing that I referred earlier, that in his reminder to Jawaharlal as to what he thought about India's development and what kind of growth and governance model, or will the people go and sit like they will Rashtrapati ji in the Rashtrapati Bhavan and other ministers in the Bhavans of this or that Bhavan of Delhi. That he didn't want. He wanted power to the people. And that's why he wanted to turn Congress into Lok Sevak Sangh. In fact, incidentally, the draft he was correcting on 29th January, and and that's why he was late on 30th January to go for his prayer when that costly event happened. But Gandhi wanted Congress to be a Lok Sevak Sangh, a people's organization. organization which will be there in the service of the community. And when after you see, when in 1977, many of the Gandhians and people who opposed emergency, when they came to the power, though there were outfits of the all earlier, and they wanted it in hurry to be made as a alternative to the Congress, not alternative Congress. They wanted it alternative Congress in a way as a Janata Party. But Jayaprakash Narayan told them that this will not do. And that's why a committee was set up. Incidentally, one of the senior Gandhians, Siddharaj Jadda, and EMS Namudripad, of all the people he has asked him, the Chief Minister of Kerala, and being even Marxist, the EMS Namudripad, he has pleaded for a very strong panchayat and a very decentralized community at the level of the district. And that's why the people's planning and the campaign that they carried way years after that in Kerala. And that was a committee set up under the chairmanship of Ashok Mehta committee. They have laid the contours of the decentralization, where these will be really the local self-governments, which will manage most of the affairs of the community, whether it is a production, whether it is a school, health, and it all. And this decentralized community will make the power. And for that, in terms of the scheme that is there in the 73rd and 74th Amendment, a lot of effort has gone into that, and resources were to be devoted to the district level bodies or panchayats and nagar parishads and urban local bodies. Half the resources at least. And in fact, when the first decentralization came after 1957, which was referred to after the Balwant Rai Mehta Committee's report, they did refer to that. But there were the three F's: the functions, functionaries, and finance. Unless they are provided in an adequate measure, I would repeat, functions, functionaries, and finance, panchayats will not take. And that's why most of the production at the level. And if there is a one thing that India can still do, and as we are thinking of in fact, right now I'm thinking in the process of putting together some of the ideas about how at the while celebrating 75th year or 75th anniversary Amrit Mahotsav of India's independence, which already has begun from the Sabarmati Ashram, I think we should be recalling some of these very important ideas of decentralization, where it has been already proved that the prevailing growth and governance model is by and large anti-people and anti-nature. We need a growth and governance model which is a pro-people, pro-nature and pro-women. स्त्री और सृष्टि के शोषण पर जो विकास आधारित है वो नहीं चलेगा. And taking into account some of these things, I think at the 75, and some of those ideas will work. भारत की अगर कोई व्याख्या है, if there is one thing that defines India still as a majority people's occupation, it is the land and tilling, the kastakari, and the other is the dastakari, the crafts, which have gone into the disuse, but now, or they have been abandoned, or people have been in a way destroyed. But now we have to revive both India's farming on the basis of resources. And a very simple definition of resource use, effective and efficient resource use, is a sustainability. We have to build a society which is based on equity and sustainability. And that can come only if we have a growth and governance model, which is a decentralized and democratized. And again here, the important point to remember that today's representative democracies, whether it is the members of parliament or the assemblies at the state level, they are legislators, they can legislate, but there has to be a participative democracy. Face-to-face community can be governed by the people who know the land, people, and resources. So a time has come, and particularly in the wake of climate change, some of these ideas, unless these resource conservation, care and conservation of the resources. So we have to go beyond the binaries of capitalism and socialism, state and market, growth and globalization, as even Raghuram Rajan now says that we have to build a third pillar of governance, and this third pillar of governance could be the decentralized institutions, which is the need of not only of India, but the entire world. And that is the only way where we can have a model of growth and governance which is in harmony with the nature. A low carbon growth trajectory can come only when we use the resources which are in harmony with the nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Desarda, for wonderful words and putting everything in historical context, as well as bringing the thing in front that being for Gandhi, the ecology and economics were the same thing. They were not part of they were two not different entities. It was a very wholesome idea, Gandhi's idea. And I was just sort of remembering, and I was engaging with a student a few months back from the Gandhi Center. And she also wrote a wonderful piece about Gandhian constitutionalism and decentralization. I've shared it on the chat. And there's an interesting way how the conversation begins there, that on 17th October 1949 in the Constituent Assembly, there's a proposal that the Gandhi's name should feature in the text of the Constitution. And Brajeshwar Prasad says that there is no space for Gandhi's name in this Constitution because this Constitution is not Gandhian at all. And he calls the Constitution as the rotten Constitution. So on these words, and taking cue from where Professor Desarda was mentioning about community and society, and we'll move on to these ideas have taken different forms in the West. For example, for a lot of Western sociologists that Professor Mark Lindley would perhaps talk about. So let me introduce you, everyone. Our next speaker, Professor Mark Lindley. Professor Mark Lindley is a professor of eminence at MGM University, Maharashtra. It's difficult to introduce Professor Lindley in a limited time, but we can simply sort of again try to introduce an introduction of him. As I said earlier, he's someone who can talk from Bach to Bapu on any of the topics of his choice. He's quite versatile that way. Now, two things that Professor Mark Lindley requested me that are worth mentioning before we go into deep into his talk is that introduce a couple of his works that he's written, and also a talk that he gave. The first one that he's writing is Meditations on Ideological Pastoralism and Gandhi's Villagism. And this is the title that he is writing with Dr. Puli Nayak, who's a former head of Delhi School of Economics. Another one that he has written is, pardon my French and German pronunciation, but I've tried hard to learn it, is a very controversial figure, Gustave Le Bon and Ferdinand Tonies, and Mahatma Gandhi as modern psychologists. That's what Professor Lindley has been working on, has written on it, and also the book's been published as a translation in Hindi. And one of the other thing that he'll talk about is one of his keynote address that he gave at Savitribai Phule Pune University in Psych Fest in the year 2020. And it was about some disturbances to mental health during what Gandhi might have reckoned to be the last day of modern Western culture as a 9-day wonder. So, there's a lot of ways that I can introduce Professor Mark Lindley, but as he always tried, or he has always thought of being introduced in a particular context, because once you lose the context, the introductions goes here and there. So I think with these words, I would ask Professor Mark Lindley to begin his talk, and over to you, Professor Lindley.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we
Can
can
you
hear
hear
you.
me? Unfortunately, I turned off the video for a moment and I don't know how to turn it back on of my face. So let's not waste time. I will talk away. Yes, and I will dare to be a little bit critical of Gandhi. Yes, I think there was a utopian streak in Gandhi. He would sometimes refer to the good old times when he thought that the members of the four Varnas all had exactly the same level of prosperity, even though there were four Varnas. They were all equal. Yeah, this utopian streak is not unique to India or to Gandhi, but I think he shared it. Now, why did he prefer the village level government in the Panchayat to the parliamentary kind of government that he was familiar with in England? In London, he had, in the last few months of his student days in London, he had fulfilled his everything except his residence requirements as a student. And so he had time on his hands and he went to hear the parliamentary debates and the best sermons in London. He knew English rhetoric at its best. And he was terrific at rhetoric himself. Not, not so much his voice as his sentences and his statements and the images he would evoke. He was a magnificent speaker in that way. And yet, I think the reason why he preferred the community face-to-face type government, which he thought would be there with Panchayati Raj, was that he did not want rhetoric to be important in people's government. Instead, he wanted what we have called democracy, valuing the other fellows' views, exchanging face-to-face, sincerely what you have observed. That's what he wanted, face-to-face, reconciliatory negotiation, rather than parliamentary type debate. That, I think, is the reason he was interested in community. And I noticed that Dr. Bajpai has, in some of his work, emphasized that we need community in the cities as well as in the villages. Yes, it's not just the village where you could hope to achieve this face-to-face exchange of sincere views and negotiation on a personal level. It's also in cities this could be achieved if people will wind down the rhetoric, yes, and focus on the sincerity of their views. Now, there is a problem with exchanging our views, and this has to do with a kind of psychology that was invented in the 1890s. It was called crowd psychology, and that was in a book written by Gustave Le Bon in Paris, and he made a distinction between individual psychology and crowd psychology. It applies to humans, and it applies to many other animals. The bird hunting the worm is individually concerned. The bird in the flock is flying with the rest, and they keep a beautiful pattern in the flock, yes? And the same is true of humans. If you go to a psychiatrist, you want to be treated as an individual, but humans behave differently when they're in a crowd than they do when they're alone. And there is an evil exploitation of this fact that was developed in the West, in Germany and Italy in the 1920s. It's called fascism, yes? Crowd psychology is the mother of mob psychology, controlled by a brilliant fascist leader. This is a phenomenon that became very important in the West. It led to the Second World War after the First World War. And it is a danger that we have always. We have it in the US with Donald Trump. They had it in Germany. It exists in many different ways in many different countries. Gandhi, however, contributed something important, I believe, to crowd psychology. And that is, he conceived the idea of a crowd where the members have very diligently cultivated self-discipline. That's really what Gandhi meant by Swaraj. He didn't just mean telling the Brits to go away. He meant that the Indians would practice self-discipline, to love rather than to hate, to learn how to cooperate, to build your Swadeshi, and on the basis of your Swadeshi, then to cooperate and to share. Yes, it's quite a paradox. You want Swadeshi to be independent as an individual, as a village, but on the basis of a modicum of Swadeshi, where you stand on your feet, you are ready to share and to reconcile and to cooperate, yes, and coordinate your activities. So there's that paradox. And Gandhi developed this alternative kind of crowd psychology that was necessary for successful satyagrah, yes, and that was the members of the crowd are exercising self-discipline. They are teaching themselves, diligently seeking to reform themselves as individuals so they can function beautifully in this unfascist, completely unfascist kind of crowd that can win the antagonist with love. This is Gandhi's contribution to crowd psychology. Now, that's not just village, that's also on a big level. So I've had these 2 points here. In the village, he thought that the face-to-face talking would displace rhetoric. Yes, that's a paradox because he was so good at rhetoric himself. And yet also, he was a great crowd psychologist, one of the greatest crowd psychologists of the 20th century. He achieved satyagraha, he achieved the independence. He led India to independence by means of this kind of discipline, nonviolent crowds. They weren't always nonviolent, but when they were nonviolent, they were very effective in persuading the British that they should leave. Yes, so these are 2 paradoxes. Now, my dear friend, Desardaji, mentioned this environmental ecological concern, that he said that Gandhi thought that all the resources should belong to everyone. Yes, yes. Now, how is that applicable today, yes, in economics? At the village level, I think this subject has been explored by a wonderful sociologist and economist named Elinor Ostrom. What she did was to prove that it is not the case that if you have things held in common by the entire population, someone will greedily take more than his or her share, and eventually the common holding will shrink down to nothing. She showed by investigation of various phenomena, social phenomena in different small communities all over the world, in the third world, how they worked out ways of cooperating in order to preserve their common resources. Yes? So I see Elinor Ostrom as a key figure in the Gandhian decentralization of government. People at the local level can talk with each other and decide how they're going to defend the resources, the natural resources accessible directly to them in their area, against dacoits, robbery from others, and against overly selfish exploitation by their own members. She developed this theory, and she got a Nobel Prize in economics for it. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, and a lot of economists had never even heard of her before she got the prize. So I cite her as a great Gandhian researcher of the late 20th and early 21st century. Yes. Those are the 2 main points I want to make, that Gandhi cherished the village over the parliamentary system of London, the great British Parliament, because he did not want rhetoric to be the essence of how you govern. You know, there was a great British prime minister who used to give wonderful speeches in Parliament, and we have his private manuscripts of the texts of his speeches, and in the margins of one of his speeches, he wrote to himself a little note: weak argument, shout. That's part of rhetoric in the Parliament. You see, you wouldn't do that if you were really doing personal exchange of views. You wouldn't shout when your argument was weak. You would shout when you thought your argument was strong rather than when it was weak. So Gandhi wanted, I think, the Panchayati Raj to be a place of personal exchange of views. Now, his view of the village needed some criticism, and it came from Ambedkar. Ambedkar said that villages were caste-ridden, and they were in Gandhi's day. Gandhi did not want that kind of village, but that was a reality of his day. So there was a problem there. And of course, it was Ambedkar who wrote the Constitution. He did a diligent job, but of course it couldn't be 100% Gandhian because Ambedkar had to take input from many sources. Yeah. So those were the 2 points, main points I want to make. That Gandhi, in spite of the fact that he was great at rhetoric, wanted Panchayat Raj, local government, in order for rhetoric to be displaced by sincere exchange of personal experiences and personal views, what we call true democracy in that sense. Not majority rule, but sharing of experiences and views. And the other thing is that Gandhi, in his way, was a master of crowd psychology, and the essence of his concept of non-fascist crowd psychology was that the individuals in the crowd, and some of the leaders especially, exercise self-discipline, constantly training themselves to make themselves better so that they can help create this loving crowd psychology that will lead to reconciliation and love between people who think they have conflicting interests. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mark, for your words. And it was an interesting perspective into crowd psychology and bringing back the idea of Swaraj and the idea of self-discipline and how to behave as community together. I mean, interestingly, as we see what happened when, Gandhi was quite upset after the events of Chauri Chaura, where the crowd wasn't able to behave in a particular way, and he called off the movement on that grounds that we are still not ready for the movement if we can't conduct ourselves in a certain way. I guess rather than panelists,
can I just add a sentence here?
Yeah, sure.
It slips out my mind.
Yeah.
If you see the chronology and what Mark was saying, like Professor Desarda was also saying, see the time gap. Chauri Chaura happens, Gandhi feels people are not trained. The next big movement comes after 10 years.
Yes.
And then the next one comes again after 10 years.
Yes.
Right.
So in this 20 years between the Chauri Chaura and the SALT movement, there was real change in the psyche of this country.
Right.
Because the SALT, the Dandi and the SALT movement was essentially non-violent.
Yes. You know,
see the way he was working. Yeah.
Let me harmonize.
Yes.
I have seen in one of the postings on the web of yours,
yes,
where you say that something we need to learn today, while we're facing these urgent problems, we still have to learn patience. Patience.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. That is it.
It may be we're so urgent, we must do it now, but maybe we must wait until the moment is really more propitious for doing it. I think that this is an example of this. Yeah.
Right. If it suits everyone, can we take questions now? Manan, if you can facilitate the process of having questions, or people can type in the chat box that is visible, I guess, to every one of us. If not, I'll read out questions from there. And I'm expecting 10 seconds of silence and people just still formulating their ideas and putting them into words. But if there's anyone who has like that urge to just blast through, please do it. No one? Come on.
Are we so clear? I don't think so.
Yeah. So, like, by the time people are figuring out questions, I would use the usual cliche that I use of using the power of the chair or the moderator or whatever and pose a question. Because when we talk about decentralization or when we talk about village, we have different imaginations of village when it comes to Gandhi, Ambedkar, and Nehru. I mean, for Nehru, the imagination of village is something backward or something that is not ready or couldn't be part of the mainstream economy, as he wanted to say. And for Ambedkar, it's not a space for republic. I mean, it's a space for it was not a space of non-violence. Village is a space of violence. Village is a space of caste discrimination. Village is a space where depending upon where people live, whether in the center or on the physical periphery of the village. So he understood village as something which is not as utopian as you would like to believe. And he loved the idea of urban space because of the anonymity. And that's how, if not annihilate the caste part, in sense that's how the caste was at least disappearing in the public transport system, right? So these were some of the concerns or these imaginations of village or decentralized village that we have through Nehru or through Gandhi and through Ambedkar, and all of them being contemporary and thinking about it, and a lot of people have written articles comparing all the three perspectives. So I just wanted to put that out here and wanted to have a discussion on it, and then we'll take the next question, which is about the separate electorate.
Yeah.
Professor Deshada.
Pradyuman,
Yeah.
What you said just now about it is not the village is not that way only a geographic locale. It is a unit of production, unit of community dwelling and all that. And in fact, I have faced it from both. I mean, a very strong Gandhians pleading for panchayats and village, all that. And for long, 35 years, I was teaching in a college established by Dr. Ambedkar himself, where most of our students came from the Dalit communities. And there is not a village either of a Gandhi's imagination or Ambedkar's experience that you have. Even today, who are the people who are suffering the most? What are the urban slums? Urban slums are at the overflow of the rural communities who cannot live on the resources there. And Mark has very profitably brought, in fact, I wanted to say about that, the Eleanor Aston, I happened to meet her in 2012, a few months before she passed away, and when she was in India. And when she was working, how the communities can manage very efficiently their resources. And all communities, and that's why, and Gandhi and Ambedkar both were in fact changed by each other's perspective. And at the end of the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate, you will find both of them accepting their each other's point of view and saying, of course, today, who are the Dalits, who are the Adivasis, the people who are not having the livelihood resources, and they are suffering the most. And whether this Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Scheme and other yojanas, which are now entitlements, they are meant to strengthen the people and to restore to them the right to the resources. Because right to resources is something very basic to the very existence of humans. And it goes beyond the anthropomorphic view of life, that it is a habitation for all beings, not only human beings, that you, and that's, I think, this, and Nehru in his later days tried to realize some of these things in his conversation with the Malnovis.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Sorry for this.
No, sir, this was perfect. Pradyum, let me link these things. The rural versus urban, which Ambedkar Sahab brought, like he said, they are den of ignorance, and somebody has asked about the Ambedkar-Gandhi conflict. Let's see what perspectives they were looking from. What Ambedkar Sahab was talking was an experiential thing.
Yes.
So his emotional level of that hurt and trauma was too much. Whereas Gandhi was out to unite the country.
Yeah.
And let me just cut the frame. Just before Quit India, it is mentioned in Pyare last phase, just a day or two before Quit India, Gandhiji had a meeting. And there were princes and kings, and there were leaders, and there were Dalits, and there were Muslims. Everybody was there. You know what Gandhi said? He said, see, after me, it is possible that Nehru would become the leader of this country. And he is a socialist. He will not allow you to be kings anymore. So if you want to survive, listen to me and share your wealth with people. Because Gandhi was at the top, he didn't want to break the country. For Gandhi could not have rejected neither the rich nor the poor. He wanted to allow everybody to exist while sharing life with each other. That was the trust issue he was talking about. The second thing was, what talisman he gave? Look at the last man.
Yes.
He also said that majority and minority is the wrong nomenclature.
Yes.
51% is majority, 49% is minority. So you can't think like this. You have to percolate all life's benefit and glory or dignity from the top to bottom. So Gandhi was not out to reject. That is why the Ambedkar-Gandhi debate is somehow highlighted in a different way. Both were talking the same stuff. Both were for the utthan of the poor and Dalit. Angles were different. So Ambedkar experientially could not understand what Gandhi was saying. So nobody makes them superior or inferior. The purpose was the same, because the communal that order would have split up. Imagine, I mean, we can easily go back and see, had it happened by that time, so how would mainstreaming would happen? The temples would not have opened because without Gandhi. So they were saying the same stuff. The processes were different, experiences were different. And for Gandhi, obviously, we have to give him this much leeway that he could not have accepted anybody being left out, whether it was a rich, poor, prince, leader. So he had to keep changing people. That was his compulsive pressure in the air.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. There's always that having the inclusion of it, even when the cabinet list was sort of proposed, and Gandhi asked that why Ambedkar's name isn't there. Because if you can't use his expertise in the government, it's not the loss of the government, it's people's loss. The next question that I have here is about separate electorate, and you can mix it up the question, how can Gandhian concept of decentralization be applicable in current times? So the two questions, one is again the same age-old debate of separate electorates and its acceptance and non-acceptance. So I think maybe any one of you can summarize it or explain to our students, and then move on to the next question, that how do we sort of implement the Gandhian decentralization or the village republic model today in our present time, and how do we start? What should be our first step, and what should be the roadmap to where we want it to be, or it's not possible anymore? So let's talk.
I could say something here in dialogue with Dr. Bajpai. He emphasized in his talk that he thought the Panchayat Raj that we actually have today, supported with money from the central government, is very different from what Gandhi had in mind. It seems to me, however, that it is a step in the right direction. Yes. And so my answer to this question, how do we go ahead, is this step-by-step patience approach. Now, this is un-Marxist in a certain sense, because the Marxists at their worst, and many Marxists are wonderful. I'm not saying that all Marxists are bad, but when they're wrong, it's because they make a categorical distinction between reform and revolution. They oppose reform because they think it is preventing the revolution from taking place. They think you have to have enough resentment and hatred so that the people underneath can rise up and kill the capitalists. Yes? So that distinction carried too far between reform and revolution is the bane of Marxist thinking. And Gandhi would have none of it. Gandhi thought that step-by-step reform could lead gradually to a revolutionary change. Yes? Yes. Yes. And so I say, in response to my colleague's remark that the Panchayat Raj today is not what Gandhi wanted, I would say, but it is a step in the right direction. Yes. Yes. So there have been more women in the Panchayat government than there were before, because there's a women's reservation in there. Now, there are many wrinkles in the way these things work out, you know, but I do see it as a positive step. Yeah. Would you like to chime in, sir? And
that is perfect, as long as the vector remains right.
Yes.
Yeah, the vector
Correct.
has to move towards what Gandhi was thinking.
That's right.
The vector goes in a different direction.
That's a very good word, the vector. And you emphasize on the web, what I read was that Gandhi was constantly had a vector to change himself.
Yes.
He was constantly examining himself and deciding how he should change to find the feasible solution to the problem. Now, our problems today are different from Gandhi's problems 100 years ago, right?
Absolutely.
So exactly what the vector is will be different because the situation is different. But the idea of constantly seeking to find the right vector, that and accepting that you have to be a little bit patient about it. This I felt this was a wonderful aha for me to find this in your writing and in your talking. Yes. Yes, so the answer is gradually, step by step with the right vector, the answer to how to achieve these things. Yes?
Professor Desada, you wanted to add something.
About the separate electorate, that was the context of the time, because Gandhi didn't want to have any division in the nationalist movement. First of all, because he thought these were the issues, because the first thing, Gandhi was a strategist who wanted to, in a way, posit it in such a way that there is no difference among the people and division, because on the basis of what has, and in fact, Gandhi's rather premonition came true after, which led to the culmination in the partition. So Gandhi was from that perspective. And in fact, Gandhi's perspective, some of them, they are very prescient when he really formulated them. But vis-a-vis the experience that we have in the 21st century, you will find many of those ideas now, they are more pertinent and practicable. About in the wake of the pandemic, what he said about the nature and the habitations and habitats. I think whole this zoonotic transfer of the diseases is just something that can be cured only when there is a holistic approach to the health. It will not come through the corporate kind of technology that we are thinking of. And on the whole, I mean, given the compulsion of the living in the present age with the face-to-face community, and particularly many of the Gandhian ideas would be really more practicable. For example, the digital and communication technology can bring more face-to-face community, though it would remain virtual, in the sense that people can interact with that. People can, I mean, much of the resource squandering, travel, and the transfer of resources can be in a way. So, I mean, in a very interesting way, Gandhi says that the purpose of this, what is the purpose of whole efforts, whether it's a political freedom or economic enterprise? It is, I mean, increasing the possibilities of civilization for our grandchildren. That's what, in fact, the Keynes had said. And his ideas of Antodaya and Swarvodaya, in many ways, unto his last, they converge in such a way that freedom of each is a precondition to the freedom of all, where Marx and Gandhi, they are sharing some of the perspective.
So this is the most important thing, sir. What you're saying, Mark, about the communists, I often tell these communists, and incidentally, my own father-in-law was the Communist Party General Secretary, CPM, in UP till 89. I keep telling the people that you have to find out a way between Marx and Gandhi.
Yes.
I mean, that is the only alternative which remains.
Yes.
The rest of it, you can keep sticking. Yes, sir.
Yes. With regard to the separate electorates, I might just add as a historical note that Gandhi was very shrewd politically when he opposed separate electorates, because he knew that if you have separate electorates, it means that you're going to get extremist candidates who win. Yes, whereas if the candidate is guaranteed to be a Dalit, but has to win votes from people of all castes, then the candidate will be proposing solutions that involve reconciliation and compromise, and these will be the better solutions. So Gandhi knew that. That's why he wouldn't go for separate electorates. Yes?
Right. There's a very, again, a question that comes up is about that in the US, the Black community has over the decades moved from the rural areas to the cities, which has reduced the racism faced by them. And is it a similar situation for Indian Dalits who have, and what are, see, already we constantly draw these parallels because of the Black Panther movement and the Dalit Panther movement. And we have been doing it even in the case of recently when a police atrocity happened and then the trial has begun a couple of days ago. So the thing is that we have these parallels with US, and especially when we talk about minority and marginalized community in the similar way. And it is because of the political movement, and not only political movement, but also a literary movement, which has gone in this direction. So I think the question here becomes very important that we talked about Ambedkar's experience in the rural India, but I don't, and I would sort of agree with the person who has asked the question that I don't feel that there is any difference between the experience of a Dalit in even today's Indian village. I mean, those experiences are not same, but they are indeed similar. So the question may be, does that migration from the rural to the urban, or dropping of surnames, or or any of those methods are helpful for Dalits, or as we can debate on the terminology, as Gandhi would like to call them, Harijans, etc. So that's the question, I guess. Perhaps, Vaishnav, I was able to frame your question properly with in your words and some of my own words.
I can say something about the US migration from rural to city. It was owing to a particular economic phenomenon when called the Tennessee Valley Authority. They, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, they decided to electrify the South by building a system of dams so that the southern plantations growing cotton would now have electric power. And that meant that the hand power, the hand labor of the black workers who were descended from the old slaves was no longer so essential to the farming as it had been before. And so this progressive step of electrification, starting in the Tennessee Valley, but spreading all over certain parts of the Deep South, led to a migration in the 1930s and 40s from the Deep South to the northern cities, Philadelphia, New York, Detroit, Boston, Cleveland, yes. And these folks from the South and came up, and they didn't like, the police had been racist back where they had been, back home. And the school teachers had been racist. So they got to the north and their children didn't respect the police and the school teachers. Yes. So we had social problems from these Negroes who had migrated up north. Now, the racism has to some extent diminished in the United States since then, no question about it, but not as much as we thought it had.
Yeah, sure.
And when problems became tough in the US, then you had this resurgence of racist fascism in Donald Trump and in the Republican leader of the Senate, who is a white racist, who was a white racist, yes, Mitch McConnell, yes. So the racism diminished, but the disease was not eliminated. It was only mitigated, there to be brought back by fascist techniques. So in order to get the vector right, we have to be mindful of the dangers of fascism. Absolutely. I believe. And this, I'm speaking about the American experience here. Now,
it's here also.
But the Indian migration, I think, from village to city is not just a Dalit migration. I think the Indian migration, the whole geography and the human geography of it is somewhat different from the migration of the blacks in America. So I turn it over now to, I am not an expert on India. I turn it over to Indians to discuss this issue. How much the analogy holds. Yes?
Sir, Professor Desai. Pradyumn, let me tell you from a different perspective. I mean, I also work on neuroscience. If you look at the human mind, I mean, it's a slight digression, but I'll bring it back to what you were talking. What holds us? Our mind is conditioned through the tradition. Whatever has gone into the human race and it is passed on from generation to generation. So if you just say one word like caste,
yes,
it is a corpus of hundreds of icons.
Yes.
The gap is the difference between me and you. Name, color, finances, living area, geography, don't touch my well, don't touch it. All those are things which are pumping it.
Yes.
So even if people migrate to city because of economic or financial reasons, dropping of name, wearing the same type of clothes, doing the similar jobs, eating in the same restaurant, these are small tidbits.
Yes.
Which are changing. But to bring back to the deeper division, it will take a hell lot of time.
Yes.
And that is what Mark was saying, patience. And that is what has happened in US. That all the icons on the superficial packing had changed, but it just took one man to come and put a fire into it, and it all blew off. So in India also, it will change. Slowly. Patience. Mark has been saying patience.
Yes.
We have to keep dropping all this. See, this is where Gandhi comes in. Why do we think he was talking of arousing the feminine within yourself? Why was he saying dispossess? Why was he saying remove untouchability? Because he knew that if you cannot start from within, at least start from outside. You keep dropping, keep dropping, keep dropping. And we Indian philosophy knows this neti, isn't it? You keep dropping things. Then finally you'll come to the core where you can just take a quantum jump to go to the other side. I think we still have to reach that point.
Yeah.
Small things can trigger off people and they will just diverge. And so it's okay that we are doing it, but yeah, we have to keep working.
In the US, I think Mr. Obama,
Yeah.
we thought this was the brave new world.
Yes.
He overplayed his hand a little bit.
Oh yes, yes, that's true.
If he had been, if he had taken only half as vigorously the steps he took,
It's
Uh,
too good.
it would have worked better, I believe. He knows that. He's a smart guy. But as president,
Yeah.
he went a little too fast, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, Pradyum.
Is there a space for
Yes, Naresh ji, your question.
actually
Naresh ji.
first I'd like to say hello to seeing Professor Desharda and Professor Mark of
Namaskar.
Namaskar. And I
Namaskar, Naresh ji.
thank the organizers that I got to know Professor Vajpayee,
Thanks, sir.
whom I did not have good fortune to listen to earlier. I was thinking about this decentralization. Several things came to mind. One is that in the light of what Jawaharlal Nehru said and what Ambedkar said about villages, that they are den of all kinds of vice, and how can you think of basing the future society on that primarily. He considered all that, Gandhi, and then he said that the village lives only in my imagination. In responding to Nehru, he said, it lives in my imagination. If you think that I'm talking about this village, that will be wrong. But still he insisted. I thought that one of the most important thing was that perhaps he believed that non-violence is not possible in the other kind of polity. That is possible because the fundamental of non-violence would be that you should be able to know what you are doing, with whom you are doing. Feedback loops are smaller, ecological point that Desai mentioned, and so on and so forth. So that I thought was very important. Now, this is very difficult to reconcile with the if non-violence. To my mind, it was the non-violence was the driving force to think about the village as the basis of the entire society. To my mind, that has been a very, very strong conviction. Now, if village also is a seat of violence, then one will have to think very deeply about it. And I think we must also recognize that since Gandhi had a big role in Ambedkar being in the having that position in the Constituent Assembly. It is not that he was ignorant of what Ambedkar's views were; they are very clear. And Ambedkar held on to those views even after Gandhi died. Many of those views. Yes. Some of his interviews subsequently, they have been very sharp critique of Gandhi. That he said that one is not able to understand that why a person is kept at that level. Also, to that extent. But I suppose we have to see that both of them are very honest about what to do for the society. That is the only way you can understand. Ambedkar was not, I don't think he was personally opposed to Gandhi. He was opposed to Gandhi because what he thought of a good society. And likewise, Gandhi also, I think they were too tall to think about their individuality. So these are some thoughts that were occurring to me that we should be thinking about that why Gandhi was so instrumental, knowing fully well that Ambedkar's, of course, Constituent Assembly was not a dumb assembly. Although it is good to say Ambedkar created a constitution, but ultimately it is a collective effort also.
Yes.
We have to, I think, recognize that. But probably Gandhi will want to give space to everybody in terms of creating a blueprint for the future society as well. A couple of comments about others also. See, this 1916 conference, or rather meeting that Desai has talked about, actually the title of that talk was, "Is economic progress inimical to," something like that, real progress. I think this is very, very important. That real progress, he meant spiritual progress, basically. Gandhi, and he said that there could be problems in that. And a couple of other quick comments that to my mind, it has been that short-term view and long-term view have a very, very important role to play. And tragedy of commons happens because of the short-term view. If they had a long-term view, and I think that is where it in our Ostrom's contribution become very, very important because she brings example after example that where it has been seen that tragedy common doesn't happen because community has a, when they work as a community, then they have a long term. They cannot work against each other as individuals. Of course, I must say that she was a political scientist, not sociologist or economist. It was a great contribution we have all learned from her. Her work was famous even before she got Nobel Prize. She was a very well-known person. So there are some of the views. And lastly, I just thought that since the title of the discussion is about decentralization, I have not heard something about that. That perhaps you can take as my question. That of power, we think in terms of legislative power and juridical power, or only executive power. Because unless we have some kind of legislative power and juridical power, which have been undermined almost completely, although some executive powers are. Yes. Without that, this autonomy and this decentralization perhaps is close to meaningless, except that you become project executor.
Yeah.
Besides that, determining the overall framework, determining whether you should take a this irrigation project or that construction project, beyond that you don't have that. How you should organize your own society, even if it is cluster villages, without giving some kind of see, Panchayat has been somewhere in the minds of people about justice system at the local level. And there is absolutely no power given to that justice level, that how it can function there. So there is neither legislative power nor juridical power. Perhaps some comment on that, or maybe a future discussion on that. You're talking about decentralization, may be very, very fruitful. And
So
I am again delighted to see all of them. And
sir,
it has gone.
Young people think there is something called Khap Panchayat. So I mean, if you imagine the whole new generation people who is going to school, they would read in civics subject about Panchayat Raj and all. But what you're saying is very true. They wouldn't know what is the Panchayat doing. So what is Panchayat doing? They think it's Khap Panchayat and all that stuff which is happening.
The Khap Panchayat, some aspects of that have come to the fore which are very pernicious.
Yes.
And no civilized society can. But remember that the 1980s farmers movement from UP was led by a leader of a Khap. And it was having a very overall view of how society should be. I don't think that, I think that is some caricature in the sense, those aspects are pernicious. They, I don't think, can be tolerated.
Yes.
But that is not the whole truth about that also.
But somebody should go back and tell it to young people. I mean, that discourse is missing.
That's right.
There has to be somebody who should. It's like, sir, I'll tell you, I told one of the tallest leader of Communist Party in this country, I said, you should realize that post 1990, there is a full generation which does not know about Marxist ideology and your movement. Because you do not go back and tell the students. You can't get on slogans of 60 years back and keep telling people. You have to go back and tell to schools and colleges. But if it doesn't happen, there'll be a huge gap in the knowledge base itself. And few universities can't fulfill that. Pradum, you know this. So,
absolutely. Also, I may mention very in the passing that taking ideas from different sources in the service of developing understanding. Ram Sarup, who wrote a small booklet kind of thing on Gandhian economics, and his analysis is CVS. Constant capital, variable capital, surplus value, C plus V plus S. You go there, in those terms, he's analyzing that almost the entire thing. So you are willing to take that from Marx, not just Marxism, okay, and put it to the service of that. And who was also perhaps close to today what some people call right wing. So you can actually, if you are open to ideas, you can take from various. And I think you very rightly said that those ideas contributed by the stalwarts, they remained very, very useful, whether it is Marx or, of course, Gandhi are talking about, but even others also, they remain. I'm sure it is a very good thing that you have mentioned about it. Thank you.
Also, like one of the things where or the premise from where Dr. Bajpayee started, that let's look Gandhi as not as like a philosopher, not as a politician, not as a saint, or in in different ways. Because if you're going to look at it, and if you have to actually take words on the value, and then it's you who are deciding which character speaks from the Gandhi. So I think it's also one of the problems that for every reader, Gandhi comes differently, and
yes.
and when you read and you try to associate it differently. But then there is a context as well, because we say that Gandhi is a thinker and he was a deep thinker, and never forget that Gandhi was also a journalist, and that's something that people forget. And so, for example, whenever he is writing a postcard, he'll make a point to say that don't publish this or publish this. There's a reason behind why he is saying it. Even if he's writing an autobiography, it's a signal. No one writes an autobiography for the sake of writing it. I mean, Khushwant Singh may be an exception,
They
but
might write it, but they wouldn't publish it. Yes.
Yeah, in the same sense, right? I mean, I wouldn't like my diaries of teenage to be published some days, right? But they still exist in the record, and I don't know what happens 200 years from now. But the point that I was trying to make here is that sometimes when Gandhi comes to us as a serious thinker, or at times when Gandhi is just an intuitive, or he's speaking out loud. See, it's 100 volumes of work, right? Gandhi is writing letters every day, right? Gandhi is at the same time is also editing Manuben's diary. I mean, there's that aspect of Gandhi, which is a very meticulous thing, where Gandhi would be opposed to an idea that, and he would say to Manuben that, what is this, etc.? There's nothing called etc. You have to write everything in detail, right? So, so the point is that sometimes Gandhi is simply reacting rather than, so for example, if there is a letter and simply, oh, this is the letter that I received from there, and that's what my reaction. And a lot of times, the construction of Gandhi is based on those reactions. And even if you look at us as people, we are like that. I mean, sometimes we as individuals are thinkers, sometimes we as individuals are reactionary people. We see something and say, oh my God, this happened. Yeah, so Professor Desarda, yeah, sorry, just a bit long.
Pradhuman,
Yes.
Pradhuman.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
हाँ, मैं बोलूँ?
जी सर,
जी सर, please.
हाँ, मैं आलोक जी, मैं बोलूँ?
जी सर, please.
हाँ, I'm glad that Naresh Sharma ji has joined our friend. In fact, incidentally, I wanted him very much that he should join this, and I'm glad. Naresh ji, hello.
जी सर.
हाँ, बहुत अच्छा हुआ कि आपने इसको ज्वाइन किया. हम चाहते थे कि आप इसी में रहें, लेकिन आप जो दो बातें कह रहे थे बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है कि it is some people, and it becomes a ideological rhetoric. They make either demonize or deify Gandhi, Marx or Ambedkar for that matter, in a very narrow fashion. And I think in the 21st century, now we have to go beyond these isms. And I am here reminded what Kosambi had advised to the Marxists. Alok ji may like it. That Kosambi had said when reviewing Dange's book, he said Marxism is a method to think and not substitute for thinking. Absolutely. Similarly, Gandhi का विचार भी एक in the context है, and Gandhi and Marx, for that matter, they are looking to the world, though from a very different prisms and points of views. In fact, I would say Gandhi, Marx, or for that matter, our Phule and Ambedkar, they have to be looked at from a holistic perspective in the context of our time. Absolutely. Because in the context, many of the ideas, for example, when Nehru took that path, and India adopted a planning and kind of growth and governance model. Nobody would talk even of those growth and governance models now in the year 2020, and particularly after 1972 and the whole climate change debate. We have to understand these political philosophies, as Nareshji was very rightly said. Gandhi's that 1916 address to the Conference of the Economists at the Allahabad, Gandhi said, is real progress against and there is a dichotomy between economic progress and real progress. And today we find, I mean, now most Nobel Prize people in economics even are saying GDP doesn't measure, it mismeasures rather. Whether you talk about the human development or development which is in harmony with the nature, I think we will have to go beyond formal Marxism and formal Gandhism and come to the points where we would really apply the ideas of these people in the context of our time. आज का युग धर्म जो है वो हमें आज प्रकृति, पर्यावरण और वसुंधरा इस संदर्भ में ही सारे विचारों को सोचने पर बाध्य करता है। और उस अर्थ में इस तरह का डिसेंट्रलाइजेशन एंड डीमिस्टिफिकेशन एंड डेमोक्रेटाइजेशन आज की आवश्यकता है। और मुझे लगता है कि इस पैनल में हम अलग-अलग हम सारे मित्र उस बात को कुछ कर पाते हैं। धन्यवाद। नरेश जी, मुझे लगता है कि आप
थैंक यू सर। नहीं, बहुत सही बोल रहे हैं सर। एक्चुअली जब प्रद्युम्न बोल रहे थे मुझे लग रहा था कि एक्चुअली गांधी इज टू मच, उसके अंदर इतनी सारी चीजें लगता ही नहीं कि एक व्यक्ति हो सकता है, इसीलिए उनको संदर्भ बना के बात करनी पड़ती है। हाँ, टुकड़ों में करेंगे तो ज्यादा पड़
जाएगा। सर लोग देखना चाहते हैं, वैसे
लोग देखना चाहते हैं।
और मैं तो सर गांधी जी के लिए आजकल 3 शब्द इस्तेमाल करता हूँ। गोपाल गांधी जी ने कहीं जिक्र किया था, एक दिन मैंने सोचा उसको तीनों को यूनाइट करते हैं कि गांधी इम्पॉसिबल है या इनकन्वीनियंट है। तो मुझे लगा गांधी इनकन्वीनियंट ज्यादा है, क्योंकि वो पालन करना मुश्किल है, तो आप फिर क्रिटिसिज्म करेंगे या डेइफाई कर देंगे, या वो तो हम कृष्ण के साथ भी करते हैं कि वो भगवान थे, हम कैसे करेंगे। राम के साथ भी हम यही करते हैं, तो राम का पालन मुश्किल है ना सर।
इनकन्वीनियंट तो शुरू से शायद रहे हैं वो
सब, हम लोग का आदत है कि वो इनकन्वीनियंस को दूर कर दें, फिर हम कहते हैं हम कैसे करेंगे।
और वो इतने अलाइव रहे हैं टिल द वेरी एंड। आपने जैसे कि उसको नोट किया कि 1922, 31, 42 में तो काफी वायलेंस हुआ।
हाँ, 42 में हुआ, पर बीच में तो उन्होंने खींच दिया 10 साल,
उसको वापस नहीं लिया। मतलब वो संदर्भ को समझते थे,
एब्सोल्युटली,
मतलब संदर्भ को समझते थे कि कितना बड़ा स्केल पे जो कुछ हो रहा है।
जी
चौरी चौरा एक जगह होना अलग बात है, और हर चीज का अपना एक सिग्निफिकेंट एक महत्व होता है। उसका महत्व ये भी दिखता है हमको कि he had not been in India for a very long time in 1922.
Yes.
And when we are growing up, Gandhi always looked old. But when some of us have become old, like I have become old, Gandhi was in his 50s.
Yes.
And early 50s, and he had courage in spite of having stalwart leaders.
Yes.
He was perhaps not the tallest leader. He had the courage to say no.
Yes.
He has courage to speak 1 year after coming to India in BHU's inauguration.
Yes, sir. Yes. वो तो कमाल का historic चीज है वो.
These things are absolutely, they just inspire. They inspire that if you really believe in something, that is what is called courage of conviction.
Absolutely.
And I think we are always learning. And ecology, always, I think both Mark Lindley and Decentralization, they are so keen on that. That stand from Gandhi is going to become more and more important. It is going to drive the world tomorrow.
बस हम लोग इतना ख्याल रखें उनको भगवान न बनने दें, हम मनुष्य की तरह से सीखें उनसे। Yeah, Pradyum.
So I think if there are no questions, we can formally conclude.
Pradyum, 1 second. Can you do me a favor?
Sure.
Ask Manan, or if you can, just put the emails across of Naresh ji, Jasada ji, and Mark, and
Right.
so just share it so we can
Yeah.
keep rocking each other's brain.
Right. So what I was suggesting is that in a conventional session, we would perhaps break up and have some snacks together and
We'll
talk.
have it here.
So because we don't have that, what we can do is that I can finally call the session close, but we can keep talking till हमारा मन जब तक नहीं भरता है तब तक हम बात कर सकते हैं. So in the sense that I declare the panel closed now, but people who still want to stay online and talk and chat and discuss things with the panelists if they are staying on, if they don't have anything on their schedule today. So we can still do that. So just so that we have the same feel of the offline and the online. So that it's not that the seminar is over and we are all going away. We are still talking and walking together. So the session is closed and now I'm
बात जारी रहेगी.
As they say, networking. आजकल के जमाने में as they say, networking.
हाँ सर, ये सब नए शब्द बड़े मजेदार हैं.
Networking हो जाती है.
Sorry to interrupt in between. Yeah, sir. Hello, sir. Sorry to interrupt in between. I would just like, since we are formally closing this session, I would just like Rahul to give a Thanksgiving speech for everyone from Social Nexus Foundation and Students of Peace, so that we can formally close the session, and then we can talk. Then we can learn more from you guys.
Thanks.
So Rahul, it would be great if you can give a Thanksgiving speech.
So thank you so much, all the panelists. One of the panelists is next to me, so I need not thank him. But thank you so much, Mark ji, Bajpai ji, for joining, and a very deep thanks to Professor Purohit, because he got a very short notice to join this session, and he agreed to moderate this session, read about bios of all the panelists, and of course the topics. So thank you so much, Professor Purohit, for making this happen.
Great.
And now you can continue.
Thanks, Rahul.
Always a pleasure. Strong.
We would also like to thank our partner for this panel discussion, which was Social Nexus Foundation. I think without them, gathering this tent would have been a great task for us. And with the help of them, gathering this much of audience was such an easy job. So we would also like to thank Social Nexus Foundation from Students for Peace. And we hope we can continue for more collaborations in future. So as Professor has already declared the session. So
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. जसोदा साहब, मैंने मेल भेज दिया आपको एक.
अच्छी बात है, नमस्कार.
ठीक है. Mark, can we have your email?
है मेरा पोता है वो राहुल.
जी जी जी.
वो करता रहेगा.
संपर्क में रहेंगे. ठीक है सर.
संपर्क में रहेंगे. बहुत आनंद आया. बहुत.
जी सर, मिलते हैं सर. ओके, बाय. थैंक यू. ठीक है नरेश जी.
जी, it was wonderful. It was wonderful. I think hopefully we'll be in touch in future.
Yeah, sure. मैं email आपका मनन से कहता हूँ, सब organize करेगा. We'll be in touch.
हाँ, मैं भी भेज सकता हूँ.
Thanks.
हाँ, नरेश जी मिलना है, काफी दिन हो गए.